Welcome to Women of the World, a show which gives a voice to women from around the world who have chosen to make the United States their home. Here's today's moderator, Barbara Lavalure.
Hello, welcome to Women of the World. My name is Barbara Lavalure and I'm your host today, along with Samarit, who will introduce herself in a moment. I've been an international photojournalist for over 55 years, and I am thrilled to welcome Meena to the show today. So why don't you introduce yourself, and then we'll have Meena introduce herself.
I'm Elder Samarit, and it's a pleasure to be here with you and with you, Meena.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. So Meena, welcome. Please let everyone know who you are and about Pangea World Theater.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so thrilled to be here, and it's a great honor to be with you, Barbara, and with you, Elder. My name is Meena Natarajan, and I am one of the artistic directors and the executive director of Pangea World Theater in Minneapolis. Pangea is that supercontinent that existed before it drifted right into many continents. So we took our theater to mean that name because we wanted to bring people from different backgrounds and ethnicities together to create work together, to really work together and express our differences and also see what similarities we had.
So one of the things that I have enjoyed about being involved in Pangea as someone who attends your performances for 25 years, actually, because you will be celebrating 25 years this summer, I understand.
That's right. It's going to be our 25th anniversary all of next year, the fiscal year. But really, Pangea was a dream that began more than 25 years ago.
Yes. One of the things that I love so much is how your diversity is personified. You always bring so many different cultures in any given performance, and I think that that's probably a basic understanding of what Pangea offers. How does Pangea differ from other theaters in the metropolitan area?
Well, you know, the thing is that we really began to bring together people from different backgrounds together. And we wanted to, I grew up in India, many, you know, and came here in 1987. And I came here to pursue a degree in zoology, not in theater. But I had always practiced theater at home. And so when I came here to do my PhD, and as I kept doing it, I felt that I started writing my first play as I was doing my dissertation. And slowly my interest grew in the play and not in the dissertation. You know, so as I was doing that, I felt that, and one of the things that we really wanted, we saw that there were theaters that had ethnically specific shows. I mean, there was Move for the Asian Americans, and then there was Penumbra, which served African Americans. And those theaters are really, really important. They're an important fabric of our community here. But we also wanted to create a space to bring people from multiple backgrounds together, to create work together, to really grapple with our differences, to create a pluriverse, because that's the world that I grew up in India. And you know, the idea that there were so many different people speaking different languages, eating different foods, different religions, and yet there were spaces that we could really talk to each other about our own, who we were as people, and engage with each other as well.
So Meena, I'd like to step back just a moment because you said that you came here to go to university. What actually brought you to Minnesota?
Well, so my partner in crime in Pangea, his name is Dipankar Mukherjee, and he became the resident director at the Guthrie Theater in around 92, 93. And so I came here ostensibly to write my PhD, my dissertation. You know, I had finished everything. I was one of those ABDs, you know, all about dissertation. And so I came here to write my dissertation. So I was holed up in an apartment most of the time while he went to the Guthrie and worked on multiple plays, and kept writing my dissertation. And pretty soon, every time I would start like an hour long into my dissertation and return, like then I would change the word document and it would become a play. I would turn to my first play that I wrote.
Wow. It's such an interesting view that you have of India as a pluriverse.
Yes.
Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the India that I grew up in, very joyfully, was a pluriverse, really. And that's the theme of our Penja season this year, is pluriverse. And it's the idea that people have multiple, they come from multiple spaces, they come from multiple backgrounds, and so how do we really be in solidarity with our multiplicity?
Yeah.
And that's the notion of the India that I grew up in. I mean, sadly, the whole world has become so fundamentalist right now. And we also wanted to create Penjia as a political space as well as a social space, because we wanted to create a progressive space that could really grapple with each other's difference as well. And so for me, that is what India was. That we could go to a school, or we could go to multiple spaces, and there were people from everywhere, and that we could actually have a conversation with each other across our differences.
The India you grew up in, so what era are we talking about? And is there something in your spiritual or political philosophy at that time that creates that opening for considering each other as an ecosystem or a pluriverse, as you're saying?
Well, I think part of it was, part of it is my personal background of my own family that created that. Part of it was, I grew up in Bombay, which is a very cosmopolitan city. And also, I grew up in, I started going to schools that were, the convent in India, the convent schools were really wonderful at the time. This was the 70s and the 80s, late 70s, the early 80s. And convent schools were considered to be good schools at the time. So you would go to your school, and then there would be nuns there. And they would, you would say the Lord's Prayer, and then you would go back home. And I come from a Hindu family.
Yes.
And also, but then you had Muslim friends at school, you had Hindu friends at school, you had Jain friends, Sikh friends. So, and that's the kind of like atmosphere that we grew up in. And also, I think that really, so I would say that. I would say that that's possibly because India was the Constitution of India is really a wonderful constitution. It's a secular constitution, so religion is not. So it basically what the India that I grew up in had multiple religions in it, multiple people in it, and so and also I think part of it was a socialist democratic space as well, and so I think that all those things had to do. And apart from that, I think that at the very core of Hinduism, even though it's kind of shifted, I feel like it's shifted in the wrong direction right now, but at the very core of Hinduism is a very pluralistic society. Yeah. And Hinduism is not people will tell you it's not a religion, it's a way of life, it's a philosophy as well.
Yes, yes.
It's not dogmatic in that way.
Yeah. So you said your family really instilled in you this pluralism, and can you tell us a little bit more?
Sure. My father was an atheist. He grew up as a very staunch Hindu, and then at some point, at 17 or 18, I feel like he shifted, but he was one of the most spiritual people I know at the same time. And I don't know how it's possible to say those two things for some people, but for me, it lives together. Because he was one of the most loving human beings that I've ever experienced in my life. And so that was really, for me, a very formative, like that you could have whatever belief you wanted and just be so loving that people would flock to you. My father died very early on. He was only 63 when he passed away, and that was in 1987. But my cousins still remember him and cry when they remember him because he was such a beautiful person. And one of the things that he taught, he always taught without being pedantic about it. Yes. I remember that we would travel in an auto, and if we didn't use words of respect with the auto driver or different people from different classes, or and the truth is that the caste system still exists in India, whether it's abolished by the Constitution, it's not, and I think it really needs to be annihilated. And at the same time, so because it's one of the most inequity-inducing systems in the world, But at the same time, I remember that my father would get very annoyed if we didn't show respect to every single human being, no matter what caste people came from or class people came from. And so that was something that really lives in my memory.
Yeah.
He always taught us that elders had to be treated with respect. So it just really, so those kinds of teachings stay in your mind.
What a beautiful legacy, and it makes perfect sense to me that you would go from zoology to theater, because I mean it's one universe,
yes,
right?
It is.
And so, but that's where we ended your story. That's where we got to. So tell us what comes next. You leave the dissertation and start writing plays, and then what happens?
That's right. Then we created Pangea, which was, and so the first year of Pangea, we produced the play that I wrote. And it was a Sufi poem called Conference of the Birds. It was an Iranian Sufi poem by Fariduddin Attar.
Yeah.
And so I adapted that into a play for Pangea World Theatre, and it got produced to my delight. And that first cast was extremely diverse. It had people from many, many different backgrounds. And some of the practices that we created around it were created by the people in the room. So when we entered the room, so part of Pangea's practice is 2 minutes of silence before we start anything. We ring a bell. We have a lamp in the center which can denote your ancestors or your, for teachers, it's not religious. It's whatever people make it mean. And people cross the threshold, enter that room, and we have 2 minutes of silence. We follow that in our board meetings, our staff meetings. Other theaters now do it across the country. People, I've heard even board members of foundations say that they do it now. And it's those kinds of little practices that help us decolonize ourselves and be in a space that is different, that in which we're spiritually in the same room together.
So Conference of the Birds remains one of my favorites, and I know you brought it back a few years ago, and I saw it again. You have a lot of different themes in your different plays, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about the themes, because I call Pangea a thinking person's theater. I don't walk away, I do walk away with wondering and asking myself questions and thinking about what I just saw, rather than just going to something and being entertained.
I love mythology. I grew up, again, my father loved mythology, told me stories of Roman and Greek mythology growing up, Indian mythology. I was very steeped in that. And so for me, that mythology would always fire me up and make me just deeply interest me. And so when I first wrote my first few plays, they were either about, something like Conference of the Birds, which is a Sufi poem from Iran, or I wrote a piece that was called The Inner World, which was about Tamil love poems from the culture that I come from, that was called The Inner World, which was 2,000-year-old Tamil love poems. That is from a body of literature called Sangam literature. So those were the themes that interested me. And then the other themes that really interest me are themes of, like, why are we fighting the endless wars we're fighting? So they're more political. The last piece that was produced by Pangea was a piece about the partition of India and Pakistan in 1947. I've written 2 plays about that. The second play was more of multiple stories being threaded together. And it was, I really feel like I am very interested, as you say, we are a thinking person's theater, and I'm really interested. So one of the things that we did was we held these pre-performance conversations, and it was really amazing to me that people from Afghanistan would come to those conversations, people from South Africa, people from Ethiopia, people, like we would literally be in a room with 30 people from 10 or 15 different countries and have conversations about what it meant, like, to be colonized, and what it meant to, because this has happened to so many people across the world, this partition of countries and borders.
So I'm very interested. You've brought up decolonization twice now. And so in the first instance, you were referencing really a spiritual practice, silence and the light, and use that or point to that as a practice that can decolonize the mind.
Right.
And then again, the conversations where people want to come and share the common practice of having been colonized. Tell us more about the interface of spirituality and decolonization.
Well, I do think that you know, there's levels of decolonization. One is the intellectual, which is we have to like unmarry ourselves from the things that were taught to us because of the colonization by British, by the political colonization of our countries, and that's happened to all over the world. In fact, even here with Native Indigenous people, and so it's hard. So for us, it's multiple practices that are happening in multiple levels, whether it's intellectual or if it's deeply spiritual. So some of the our practices is really working very closely with Indigenous. We started recognizing land very early, that this was First Nations land. Yes. We worked with Indigenous folks right from 1995, before Pangaea was created. One of our elders, Sharon Day, who is also on our board of directors in town, is one of the most amazing human beings ever, and she is a water warrior. And so she's somebody who's been my mentor, our mentor at Pangaea, and taught us so many things about what it means to live in this place in Minnesota. And so I really feel that part of decolonization is really like learning how to work with different folks around you, acknowledging the land that you're on, acknowledging that this is First Nations land, and then changing your own, and then at a spiritual level, changing your practices about like, how do you enter space? What do you do when you enter space? How do you be in a space? Those are really, that distinction is very important. It's like what's outside and then you carry it inside yourself.
Which ties into another question. You said you were amazed at the diversity in terms of nationality and ethnicity of people who came. I'm sure you've reflected on that for 25 years. So what is it that attracts such a multiplicity of people to those pre-performance conversations?
I guess, really actually people are attracted to the stories that are on stage. Because one of the things that we've always been committed to is having multiple stories on stage. And really, for us, it always begins with relationships with people. Again, a decolonizing practice. You eat food together, And so it's really that entering, and one of the ways that we've done that is by working with, when you work with the community, it's who do you work with? Yes. How do you not enter a community as a colonizer yourself? Because we are all capable of that, because those are the internal practices we've learned as well. When I grew up in India, we did mostly British and American plays. And you were not taught to appreciate your own culture in school.
Exactly.
You were taught to appreciate, like the plays that I've often done in my high school is dead white men, plays by dead white men. And I'm actually writing a play about that right now.
So, the colonization of the mind.
That's right.
That's just the mind, the heart, and the spirituality.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's so you can you can think intellectually that you've been decolonized, but then every practice sometimes is not, right? So it's funny. My Dipankar, who is my partner, worked with Fugad in South Africa. And one of the things that Fugad always said to him was that apartheid is just like this 2 inches between you and me. It's not between Mandela and de Klerk. It's like this 2 inches that exists between us. And that's really, we took that very seriously. That made a huge impact on all of us. And so it's like, how do we treat people when we're in a room together? How do you create community?
Speaking of community, tell us about what you're doing in the community around Lake Street. And you also mentioned an organization, a director's organization earlier. Tell us about that.
So those are a couple of the programs that Pangaea has. One of the programs that we have is called Lake Street Arts. And Lake Street Arts is a community-based vehicle of creating arts and culture practices on Lake Street. It's really how do we create so one of the things, Lake Street Arts is a community-based program, and we bring artists to the community on Lake Street. It's really about bringing Somali, Latinx, Indigenous folks, and other folks who live on Lake Street together to counter the gentrification that's happening on Lake Street. And so some of the things that we've done is we've created a huge mural on Lake Street based on the comprehensive plan by the city of would love about Lake Street. So that mural is all about what people love about Lake Street. It's right next to the plaza. You can see it. So that's one of Penja World Theatre worked with Good Space Murals to create that mural. Then we've created a couple of public visual arts projects. We've also done poetry in the windows by youth poets. So we had youth poets do poetry in the windows of businesses so that we could bring people into those businesses, but also have youth, writing poetry about the different businesses, about the diversity and the beauty of Lake Street.
Yes.
So those are a few programs. We ran something called an Art Organizing Institute, where we trained artists to do community development work. And each artist had their own project on Lake Street. So these are a couple of the projects, and those projects are still going on today. We're doing a site-specific, the next huge project is we're doing a site-specific play on Lake Street, which will come up, which will happen in the next couple of years. So those are some of the, and then the other program that you spoke of, Barbara, it was the National Institute for Directing and Ensemble Creation. So we really believe also that you do very local work, but you also at the same time stay connected with national and then international. So the National Institute for Directing and Ensemble Creation was begun in 2012 as a pilot to bring together artists from all over the country. It was really an initiative to support women directors and directors of color.
Wow.
Because that was a lack that we saw in the field as a whole in this country. And that there were not enough women directors and there were not enough directors of color. So that's why stories were not being told that needed to be told. People's stories, immigrant stories, African American stories, etc. So we brought together about 25 to 30 people from all over the country and from across the world to exchange, just do a little peer exchange, just exchange their methodologies with each other, to exchange ensemble methodologies, how do they create their own ensemble, and also directing, like share what they do in their directing practice. And that was so amazing. So we've continued that until today. And so we have an amazing National Institute for Directing and Ensemble Creation, and now it's become also a mentorship institute. So there's like a peer exchange component where people exchange techniques, practices, but there's also a mentorship component where we're training the next generation of directors. I was part of the Women Playwrights International, which is for playwrights across the country and across the world, actually. And so I was the president of the executive committee of Women Playwrights International in 2000 to 2003. And I helped convene with the people in of amazing international conference in the Philippines. Wow. But it was everybody doing our work together.
It all feels very vibrant. I'm going back to the local on-site organizations, if you will, and wondering how involvement in these Lake Street activities influences either the choice or the performances of the particular pieces that you put on, and vice versa.
Cool. I mean, I feel like everything is so organic with Penja. So nothing's come out of like, oh, we'd like to do that story right now because it's the relevant of the thing to do, right? It's really been, and yet it's relevant because it's always from the time and space that we live in. And so just an example of something like that. So in 2005, or just before that, we started creating, we worked for many years with the Advocates for Human Rights. And because human rights is a huge part, social justice and equity are huge parts of our mission. And so they wanted us to dramatize a study of theirs that was about that was about bias against immigrant women. And so we had a 75 women were interviewed for this, and so we took that interview, and then we also talked to the advocates in this community, and we wrote a play. And the play was very ensemble driven and written by people in the ensemble, and then I took it and refined it. But the play itself was about domestic violence in immigrant communities, and that was taken to multiple spaces. I mean, it was taken, judges saw it, the first newly elected legislators saw it. I really believe that we need to figure out how we can influence policy.
Yes.
And so we sat at many policy tables. We created a battered battered and refugee women's task force with immigrant refugee women, immigrant women, immigrant advocates, immigrant, people from shelters, people who were like in that field, who were doing policy. And so we would talk about how could we get the play, but also the ideas from the play across to multiple advocates across the state. This also got recorded and went across the country. So really, I'm describing that program to say that. So that program went on from 2005 to 2012 in a we would create whole day trainings, both for victims of domestic violence, but also for advocates.
Yes.
And we would do it with this task force of amazing human beings. But the thing that we noticed then was that, when the Latino women were being when they were going after Latinx women in buses in say Fargo, Moorhead, they couldn't come to the Twin Cities. There were so many raids on Lake Street that were catching undocumented workers. We found that one of the programs that came out of that program was something called hyphenations. Like we wanted to tell the story of Latinx people on Lake Street. We said, we need to humanize the story. We need to talk about these people who are human beings, who are trying to build a better life for themselves and their families when they come here. And so we created a program called Hyphenations. And that program was literally only for Latinx community. We created it with the community. This was the precursor of the Lake Street Arts program. And I remember when we created the first play, we did a piece about crossing the border. And there were Somali members of Lake Street who came and saw this piece, and they said, we really want that. We would love for us to create a piece like that for our community. Because and I described our process, which was very community-based, which really hired curators from the community, which really was also teaching Spanish. They also wanted Spanish and English language lessons. So we had something called Paso Doble, where we had Spanish and English language lessons exchange. And we had a play. So there was also art activities, embodiment activities, etc. So then we said, we have this idea that we want to create that brings together multiple communities. And if you would love to, and we'll also create specific programs for each community, but we would love a space.
Thank you so much, Meena, for being with us today. We could obviously go on for a long time. And thank you also to Elder Semarit. It was great to have you here. You asked such great questions.
Wonderful
to be here. Thank you for being with us. And thank you for joining us today in Women of the World.